Why would a faith that declared all flesh to be a prison of rotting meat inspire its followers to defend their stone fortresses with such savage, unyielding courage? The chronicles of the 13th century speak of a heresy so profound it claimed the God of the Old Testament was in fact Satan, a lesser evil deity who had trapped pure spirits in a world of decay. This was the belief of the Cathars, the pure ones, and their existence in the sun-drenched lands of Languedoc was an intolerable stain on the seamless tapestry of Christendom. Their story is not one of saints and sinners, but of a civilization so vibrant, so utterly alien to the rigid doctrines of Rome, that its only possible fate was complete and total annihilation. It is a story written in blood and fire, a testament to the fact that the most dangerous idea is not one that is wrong, but one that offers a compelling alternative. The extermination of the Cathars was more than a crusade. It was a blueprint for genocide, a chilling dress rehearsal for the organized horrors of centuries to come, proving that a book, a song, or a single whispered prayer could be deemed more dangerous than 1,000 swords. Their world was one of troubadours and courtly love, where poetry was a higher calling than prayer, and lords ruled with a lighter hand than the iron-fisted kings of the north. In this southern realm, nestled between the Pyrenees and the Rhone River, a different kind of Christianity had taken root, one that had travelled along ancient trade routes from the east, carrying whispers of Bulgarian bogomils and Persian Manichaeism. It proposed a radical, terrifying duality. Two gods, one good and one evil, locked in an eternal struggle. The good God ruled the unseen spiritual realm, a world of light and perfection. The evil god, the Rex Mundi, or king of this world, was the creator of everything material, the earth, the stars, the trees, and most importantly, the human body. This flesh, they believed, was a tomb, a cage created by a cosmic tyrant to imprison souls of light. The Catholic Church, with its golden crucifixes, its jewel-encrusted cathedrals, and its sacraments rooted in physical things like water, bread, and wine, was, in their eyes, nothing less than the Church of Satan himself, an institution that worshipped the very matter they sought to escape. This was not a subtle theological disagreement. It was a declaration of war on the very foundations of medieval reality. The appeal of this stark ascetic faith was immense in a land weary of a corrupt and worldly clergy. Local priests were often illiterate, bishops lived like feudal lords, and the Pope in Rome seemed more concerned with politics and power than with the salvation of souls. The Cathars offered a startling contrast. Their spiritual leaders, known as the Perfects or Perfecti, lived lives of extreme austerity. They were strict vegetarians, abstaining from all meat, eggs and cheese, anything born of sexual congress. They were celibate, owned no property, and travelled in pairs, dressed in simple black robes, preaching to all who would listen, from the count in his castle to the weaver at his loom. They were men and women of learning and quiet dignity, and their example shone brightly against the perceived hypocrisy of the Roman Church. For the common believer, the credente, the path was much easier. They were not required to follow the strict ascetic code of the perfects. They could marry, own property, and live normal lives, bound only by a promise to receive the faith's single essential sacrament, the consolamentum, before death. This consolation was a laying on of hands that was believed to purify the soul, break the cycle of reincarnation into other fleshly prisons, and release it back to the realm of the good God. It was a faith that demanded everything from its clergy and very little from its laity, a structure that proved incredibly successful. The nobility of Languedoc, fiercely independent and resentful of outside authority, whether from the King of France or the Pope of Rome, saw in Catharism a convenient way to assert their autonomy. They protected the perfects, welcomed them into their courts, and often their own wives and daughters became esteemed female perfects, enjoying a level of spiritual authority unheard of for women in the Catholic world. Here, in the Occitan-speaking South, a parallel civilization was taking shape, one with its own bishops, its own rituals, and its own deep-seated belief system. Rome watched this flourishing culture of heresy with growing alarm. At first, it sent preachers, men of learning and debate, like Saint Dominic, to try and win the people back through reason and argument. But their efforts were largely met with polite indifference or open mockery. How could a lavishly dressed papal legate, traveling with a grand retinue, convince people to abandon a faith whose leaders lived in apostolic poverty? The debates were a failure. The theological chasm was simply too wide to be bridged by words. The Cathars did not merely interpret the Bible differently, they read an entirely different story between its lines. For them, Jesus was not God made flesh, for the divine could never inhabit a corrupt material body. He was a pure spirit, an apparition sent by the good God to show humanity the path to escape. The cross, the central symbol of Catholic salvation, was to them an instrument of torture, a symbol of the evil God's triumph in the material world. The Vatican was not just facing a few scattered heretics, it was facing a fully formed counter-religion that threatened to sever the entire south of France from its control. The lords of Languedoc were defiant, the people were converted, and the cancer of this wine-coloured heresy, as one chronicler called it, was spreading. Patience in Rome was wearing thin. Words had failed. Soon another tool would be chosen. What would you do if your conscience stood against the most powerful institution on earth? Would you defend your personal belief, or would you yield to overwhelming force to save your home and family? Let us know in the comments. The power of this alternative church did not lie in stone buildings or accumulated wealth, but in its human network, a spiritual army that operated without swords or armor. The perfects were the generals and officers of this silent force. To become one of them was an arduous commitment, culminating in the reception of the consolamentum, not as a deathbed rite, but as an ordination into a life of punishing self-denial. After this ritual, they were seen as living vessels of the Holy Spirit, semi-divine beings whose every action was a prayer and whose every word was a lesson. They became the heart of the Cathar community, serving as priests, confessors, and spiritual guides. Their serene acceptance of hardship and their unwavering commitment to their ideals gave them an almost supernatural authority. To the common credente, sheltering a perfect was a sacred duty and an immense honor, even as it became increasingly dangerous. These believers formed the vast body of the Cathar civilization, a secret nation hidden within the public one. A weaver in his workshop in Albi, a merchant in Toulouse, a knight in his castle in the Pyrenean foothills, they were all connected by their shared faith and their reverence for the black-robed wanderers who brought them solace. This created a society where religious tolerance was the norm. It was not uncommon for a family to have both Catholic and Cathar members living side by side in peace. A lord might have a Catholic wife while his sister was a Cathar perfect, and he would financially support both the local priory and the secret heretical community. This casual blending of faiths was, for Rome, perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Languedoc problem. It suggested that the authority of the one true church was not absolute, that there might be other paths to God, a concept that struck at the very heart of papal supremacy. Women in particular found a liberating and empowering role within the Cathar faith. While the Catholic Church offered women two primary paths, marriage and subordination to a husband, or the cloistered life of a nun, Catharism offered them spiritual equality. A female perfect, a perfecta, held the same rank and commanded the same respect as her male counterpart. They could preach, administer the consolamentum, and lead communities of believers. Wealthy widows often converted their homes into safe houses and convents for the perfects, becoming powerful patrons and leaders in their own right. Figures like Esclarmonde de Foix, the sister of a powerful count, were not just noble women, but respected theologians who participated in public debates against Catholic clergy. This empowerment of women was seen by the church establishment as a grotesque perversion of the natural order, another piece of evidence confirming the diabolical nature of the heresy. This parallel society was highly organized. The Cathars had their own dioceses with bishops and a clear hierarchy. They held secret councils, like the one at Saint Félix de Caraman in 1167, where leaders from across Europe gathered to delineate territories and standardize doctrine. This was not a disorganized peasant superstition. It was a structured, international religious movement that was growing in confidence and sophistication. It functioned as a state within a state, a church within a church, systematically replacing Catholic institutions with its own. In many towns, the Cathars operated their own hospices, schools, and workshops, creating a social fabric that rendered the official church increasingly irrelevant to the daily lives of the people. This was a direct economic and social threat. Every donation that went to a Cathar perfect was one that did not go into the church's coffers. Every dispute settled by a Cathar elder was one that did not come before an ecclesiastical court. The Pope in Rome, Innocent III, was a man of formidable intellect, a brilliant canon lawyer, and a ruler who believed passionately in the absolute authority of the papacy over all earthly matters. He was not a man to tolerate such a challenge. He saw Languedoc for what it was, a declaration of spiritual independence that, if left unchecked, could fracture Christendom. He understood that he was not dealing with a few misguided souls, but with an entrenched and organized enemy that had captured the hearts and minds of an entire region. His early attempts at a diplomatic solution, sending legates and preachers, had been an abject failure. His calls for the local lords to suppress the heresy were ignored. The Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, the most powerful noble in the region, prevaricated and made empty promises. Raymond was a complex character, a cultured, worldly man who, while likely not a Cathar believer himself, ruled over a territory where the heresy was deeply woven into the social and political elite. Persecuting the Cathars would have meant persecuting his own vassals, his own neighbors, his own family. It would have been political suicide. He chose a path of calculated inaction, a dangerous game of stalling the inevitable. But Innocent III's patience was finite. He was beginning to realize that the disease of heresy in Languedoc was too advanced for a gentle cure. A more surgical, more brutal solution would be required. The letters flying between Rome and the princes of the north began to take on a new tone. They no longer spoke of conversion, but of dispossession. They spoke of a holy war not against the infidel in a distant land, but against fellow Christians in the heart of Europe. The Pope began to lay the groundwork for an unprecedented action, a crusade on Christian soil, where the spiritual reward of forgiveness for sins would be sweetened with a more tangible prize, the rich lands of the heretical southern lords. A pretext, a single, unforgivable act of defiance, was all that was needed to unleash the storm. That pretext would soon be provided by a hot-tempered papal legate and an unknown assassin on the banks of a river. The man who would light the fuse on the Languedoc powder keg was a Cistercian monk named Pierre de Castelnau. He was one of Pope Innocent III's chief legates, a man filled with a righteous, unbending zeal that bordered on fanaticism. His mission was to force the lords of the south into compliance, to make them actively hunt down and persecute the heretics within their domains. He traveled through the region with an arrogance that alienated even those who might have been sympathetic to his cause. He publicly humiliated bishops he deemed too soft on heresy and issued excommunications like a provincial magistrate handing out fines. His primary target was the most powerful and most recalcitrant of all the southern nobles, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. The relationship between the two men quickly devolved into a bitter personal feud. In their meetings, Castelnau was accusatory and demanding. Raymond was evasive and dismissive. The legate saw the Count as a cynical protector of heretics, a man shirking his sacred duty to God. The Count saw the legate as an arrogant foreign agent, attempting to undermine his authority in his own lands. The final confrontation took place in early January 1208 at Saint-Gilles, near the mouth of the Rhône River. The meeting was a disaster. It ended in a shouting match, with Castelnau renewing his excommunication of Raymond and accusing him of perfidy to his face. The legate, seething with anger, stormed out and made for the river, intending to cross it the next morning and leave the Count's accursed lands. He spent the night at an inn near the ferry. What happened in the misty dawn of the following day, January the 14th, would change the course of European history. As Pierre de Castelnau and his party prepared to board the ferry, a man approached them. He was, according to the chronicles, a minor official or knight in the service of Count Raymond. An argument broke out, escalated quickly, and the man drew a lance or a spear and plunged it into the legate's side. Pierre de Castelnau fell, mortally wounded. His last words were reportedly, "May God forgive you as I forgive you." The identity of the assassin and the motive for the attack remain a historical mystery. Was he acting on the direct orders of Count Raymond, finally pushed past the breaking point? Was he a loyal vassal who, having witnessed the humiliation of his lord, decided to take matters into his own hands? Or was it a random act of violence, a robbery gone wrong, conveniently timed? We will likely never know. But in Rome, the nuances did not matter. When news of the murder reached Pope Innocent III, his grief quickly turned to a cold, calculated fury. This was the pretext he had been waiting for. The assassination of a papal legate was an attack on the Pope himself, an act of sacrilege that could not go unpunished. He immediately placed the blame squarely on Raymond of Toulouse, declaring him a demonic accomplice in the murder of a holy martyr. The propaganda machine of the Church sprang into action. Pierre de Castelnau was instantly canonized, hailed as a saint who had shed his blood for the true faith. Across the churches of northern France, sermons were preached, portraying the South not just as a land of heretics, but as a nest of assassins and murderers, a place of profound moral darkness that had to be cleansed with fire and steel. In March of 1208, Innocent issued a papal bull that was, in effect, a declaration of war. He called for a crusade, the first ever to be directed not against Muslims in the Holy Land or pagans in the Baltic, but against a Christian territory in the heart of Christendom. He offered unprecedented spiritual rewards. Anyone who took up the cross to fight in the South for a mere 40 days would receive a plenary indulgence, the complete remission of all confessed sins. It was a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card. But he offered something more. He declared the lands of the heretics and their protectors forfeit, to be seized and held by whichever crusading lord was strong enough to take them. It was an irresistible combination of piety and plunder, a call to arms that appealed equally to the devout and the greedy. The barons of northern France, a warrior class bred for conflict, responded with enthusiasm. They were pious men, but they were also land-hungry younger sons and ambitious knights who saw in the fertile lands of Languedoc a golden opportunity for advancement. An immense army began to gather at Lyon, a force of thousands of knights, men-at-arms and camp followers, all bearing the cross on their tunics. King Philip Augustus of France, a shrewd and cautious monarch, declined to lead the crusade himself, preoccupied with his rivalry with the King of England, but he gave his blessing and allowed his vassals to go. He knew that the chaos in the south could only strengthen the power of the French crown in the long run. Faced with this terrifying mobilization, Raymond of Toulouse panicked. He had never intended for things to go this far. He dispatched envoys to Rome, proclaiming his innocence and begging for forgiveness. Innocent, a master diplomat, saw an opportunity to divide his enemies. He offered Raymond a chance to save himself, but the price was total and utter humiliation. In June of 1209, at the very same town of Saint-Gilles where the legate had been murdered, Count Raymond performed a public penance. Stripped to the waist, with a rope around his neck like a common criminal, he was led to the door of the church and ceremonially scourged by another papal legate. He swore an oath to obey the church in all things and, in the ultimate act of submission, agreed to join the crusade himself, to lead the invading army against his own people and his own lands. It was a stunning betrayal, but one born of desperation. He hoped that by submitting, he could guide the crusading storm away from his own core territories. He was wrong. The army gathering at Lyon was a force of nature, and it had a momentum that no single man could control. Its leaders were not interested in the Count's repentance. They were interested in his lands, and their first target was not the Count's capital of Toulouse, but the lands of his young nephew, Raymond Roger Trincavel, Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne. The Crusaders began their march south, a river of steel flowing down the Rhône valley. The storm had broken, the cleansing was about to begin. The crusading army, a magnificent and terrible sight, 30,000 strong, descended upon Languedoc in the summer of 1209. Their first major objective was the city of Béziers, a prosperous town perched on a hill overlooking the Aube River. It was a Trincavel stronghold, a city known to be a haven for Cathars. Refugees from the surrounding countryside had flooded into the city, confident in the strength of its high medieval walls. The city's leaders, a mix of Catholics and Cathars, refused the Crusaders' demand to hand over a list of 222 known heretics they felt secure. They were prepared for a long siege, conventional medieval affair of catapults and starvation. They had no idea they were about to face a new kind of warfare, one driven not by strategic objectives but by an apocalyptic religious fury. What happened next on July the 22nd, 1209, the feast day of St. Mary Magdalene, was not a battle. It was a paroxysm of violence that would echo through the centuries. The siege had barely begun. The Crusader leadership was still debating strategy when a group of defenders on the walls began to taunt the besiegers below. In response, a band of undisciplined auxiliaries, the so-called ribauds, the lowest class of camp followers, armed with little more than knives and clubs, made a rash, unauthorized charge toward one of the gates. The defenders, overconfident, launched a sortie to drive them off. It was a fatal mistake. The ribauds fought their way through the open gate, followed closely by the knights who saw their chance. The city's defenses were breached in a matter of minutes. Chaos erupted within the walls. The Crusaders poured into the narrow streets, a vengeful tide of steel. The townspeople, caught completely by surprise, fled in panic, seeking sanctuary in the city's largest churches, the Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire and the Church of the Madeleine. They believed that even in the heat of battle, the sanctity of a church would protect them. They were tragically mistaken. The Crusader knights and soldiers, faced with a city full of people, both Catholic and Cathar, were unsure how to proceed. How could they distinguish the heretic from the true believer? It was at this moment that the spiritual leader of the crusade, the papal legate Arnaud Amaury, the abbot of Citeaux, is said to have uttered one of the most chilling commands in military history. When a knight asked him how they should tell the Cathars from the Catholics, Amaury replied, "Cadaiti eos, novit enim dominus, qui sunt eius." Kill them all, for the Lord knows those who are his. Whether Amaury actually spoke these exact words is debated by historians, but they perfectly capture the spirit of what followed. The Crusaders took the command to heart. They stormed the churches. They broke down the doors and slaughtered everyone they found inside. Men, women, children, priests, cowering at the altar. No one was spared. The massacre was total, indiscriminate, and brutally efficient. People were cut down where they stood, hacked to pieces in the aisles and pews. The stone floors ran slick with blood. In the Church of the Madeleine alone, 7,000 people were said to have been butchered. The slaughter continued throughout the city for hours. By the end of the day, Béziers was a silent charnel house. The entire population, estimated at anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 souls, had been exterminated. The city was then looted and set ablaze, the fires burning so intensely that the cathedral itself was heavily damaged. The smoke from the pyre of Béziers could be seen for miles, a grim signal to the rest of Languedoc of the fate that awaited any who resisted. The psychological impact of the massacre was precisely what the Crusader leaders had intended. It was an act of calculated terror designed to break the will of the South. News of the horror spread like wildfire. A wave of fear washed over the region. The Crusaders, Amaury wrote with grim satisfaction to the Pope, had killed nearly 20,000 people without regard to rank, age, or sex. The strategy worked. Many towns and castles, terrified into submission, surrendered without a fight. the crusading army marched on to its next major target, the magnificent fortified city of Carcassonne, the capital of the Trinquevel lands. Here, the young Viscount Raymond Roger Trinquevel prepared for a proper siege. Carcassonne was one of the most formidable fortresses in Europe, a concentric masterpiece of defensive architecture. But the horror of Béziers had demoralized his men, and the city's water supply was cut off by the besiegers. After a short siege, Trinquevel sought to negotiate a surrender. He was lured into the Crusader camp under a promise of safe conduct, only to be seized and thrown into his own dungeon, a clear violation of the chivalric code. Without their leader, the city surrendered. Raymond Roger Trinquevel died in captivity a few months later, officially of dysentery, though many suspected poison. The conquest of the Trinquevel lands was complete. The Crusaders had achieved their initial objectives with shocking speed and brutality. Now they needed a new leader, a warlord, to hold the conquered territories and continue the war against the remaining lords of the south. The great nobles of the north, having fulfilled their 40-day service and secured their spiritual rewards, were largely content to return home. The leadership of the crusade and the title of Viscount of the conquered lands were offered to several high-ranking barons, but they all refused, seeing the task of pacifying a hostile and rebellious population as a poisoned chalice. Finally, one man, a minor baron from near Paris, stepped forward. He was known for his piety, his unwavering courage, and his terrifying military ruthlessness. His name was Simon de Montfort. An iron shadow was about to fall across Languedoc. Would you, as a commander, ever sanction a strategy of total terror like the massacre at Béziers if you believed it would shorten a war and save lives in the long run? Is the goal of a swift victory worth the price of such a brutal method? Share your difficult choice in the comments. Simon de Montfort was the perfect instrument for the brutal task ahead. A seasoned warrior who had fought in the Holy Land, he was a man of unshakable faith and boundless ambition. He genuinely believed the Cathars were servants of the devil and that exterminating them was God's work. He also saw the crusade as a magnificent opportunity to carve out a kingdom for himself in the rich southern lands. He accepted the titles of Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne and became the new military commander of the Holy War. What followed was a long, grinding, and exceptionally cruel period of conquest. The initial shock of the Béziers massacre had worn off, and the Occitan lords, realizing that submission meant dispossession, began to organize a fierce resistance. The war devolved into a series of brutal sieges of the region's countless fortified castles, or castradixtes, perched atop steep, rocky peaks known as puogs. These were years of scorched earth, of raids and counter-raids, a bitter guerrilla war fought with none of the chivalric niceties that supposedly governed medieval warfare. Simon de Montfort proved to be a military commander of genius, but his genius was matched only by his cruelty. He was methodical, relentless, and utterly without mercy. At the siege of Minerve in 1210, after the castle surrendered, he gave the 140 Cathar perfects inside a choice: convert to Catholicism or be burned alive. He had a great pyre built at the foot of the castle. Led by their elders, all 140 men and women refused to recant. They walked willingly into the flames, many throwing themselves onto the pyre with cries of joy, believing they were finally escaping the prison of their flesh. It was a scene of mass martyrdom that would be repeated time and again. At the fortress of Lavaux in 1211, the brutality reached new heights. After the castle fell, Montfort had the commander, Aymery of Montreal, and 80 of his knights hanged. Aymery's sister, the Lady Giraud, a noblewoman revered as a Cathar saint, was thrown down a well and stoned to death. Then 400 Cathar perfects found in the town were rounded up and burned in what the chronicler Pierre de Vaux de Cernay gleefully described as the greatest bonfire ever seen. For every castle he took, Montfort's reputation for terror grew, but so did the hatred against him. He became the living embodiment of the brutal northern occupation. The resistance coalesced around the man he had displaced, Count Raymond of Toulouse, who, having seen his attempts at appeasement fail, finally took up arms against the crusade. He was joined by other great southern lords, creating a powerful coalition. The turning point of the war came on September the 12th, 1213, on a plain just outside the town of Muret. Simon de Montfort, with a force of less than 1,000 knights, found himself facing a massive allied army led by Raymond of Toulouse and his powerful brother-in-law King Peter II of Aragon. Peter was a celebrated hero of the Reconquista, a champion of Christendom, but he was also a feudal overlord to many of the southern lords and could not stand by and watch Montfort devour their lands. The Southerners and their Aragonese allies had an overwhelming numerical advantage, perhaps as many as 20,000 men against Montfort's 2,000. Victory for the South seemed certain. But Simon de Montfort was a master tactician. In a daring and brilliant cavalry charge, he smashed through the larger, less disciplined allied army. King Peter of Aragon was cut down and killed in the chaos, and his death shattered the morale of his army. The Battle of Muret was a catastrophic, unmitigated disaster for the Occitan cause. The southern army was routed, their greatest protector was dead, and their will to fight was broken. Montfort's victory was total. He was now the undisputed master of Languedoc. He triumphantly entered Toulouse, and for a time it seemed the war was over. He had won. But his hold on the south was built on fear, not loyalty. In 1216, the citizens of Toulouse, pushed too far by his tyrannical rule, rose in rebellion and welcomed Raymond back into the city. Simon de Montfort was forced to lay siege to his own capital. It was a long and bitter struggle. For 9 months, he tried to retake the city that had defied him. On June the 25th, 1218, while inspecting his siege engines, a stone was launched from the city walls. The chronicles, with a touch of poetic justice, claim the mangonel that fired the stone was operated by the women of Toulouse. The stone struck Simon de Montfort squarely on the head, crushing his skull and killing him instantly. The Iron Count, the butcher of Languedoc, was dead. His death was celebrated with wild jubilation throughout the south. The heart of the crusade had been ripped out. The Occitan resistance flared back to life, and for a few brief years it seemed as though the tide might turn. But the dream of an independent South was already doomed. The war had changed. It was no longer just a papal crusade. The French crown, seeing its chance, now stepped in to claim the prize. The final phase of the war would not be a holy war, but a straightforward royal conquest. The armies of the King of France would succeed where the Crusaders had failed, not through fanaticism, but through sheer, inexhaustible resources. The military struggle was entering its final act, but a new, more insidious weapon was already being forged in the halls of the Vatican, a weapon designed not just to defeat armies, but to peer into the very souls of men and women and to extinguish the last embers of dissent. The age of the knight was ending, the age of the Inquisitor was about to begin. The death of Simon de Montfort and the subsequent resurgence of the southern lords proved to be a false dawn for Languedoc. While the Occitan forces, led by Raymond VI and later his son, Raymond VII, managed to reclaim much of their territory, they could not win the war. They had won a battle against the Crusade, but they were now facing the full might of the Capetian monarchy of France. King Louis VIII led a massive royal army south in 1226, in what was known as the King's Crusade. Faced with such overwhelming force, organized resistance crumbled. A final peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, was signed in 1229. It was a complete surrender. Raymond VII was stripped of most of his lands, which were absorbed into the royal domain of France. He was forced to promise to hunt down heretics and to have his daughter and heir marry the French king's brother, ensuring that upon his death the remainder of his lands, including the great county of Toulouse, would pass to the French crown. The Albigensian Crusade, the 20-year war that had laid waste to the south, was officially over. But for the Cathars, the true reign of terror was just beginning. The war had shattered their political protection and driven their faith underground, but it had not eradicated the belief itself. The perfect still travelled in secret, hiding in the forests and remote villages of the Pyrenean foothills. The Catholic Church knew that military conquest was not enough. To truly extinguish the heresy, they needed to wage a different kind of war, a war of surveillance, interrogation, and psychological terror. They needed a specialized institution, a permanent tribunal with absolute power to hunt, prosecute, and punish heresy wherever it might hide. And so in the 1230s, the Papal Inquisition was born. This was not the familiar, localized Episcopal Inquisition that had existed before. This was a new, centralized, and terrifyingly efficient machine of repression, answering only to the Pope. Its agents were drawn primarily from the newly formed mendicant orders, particularly the Dominicans, the order of preachers founded by St. Dominic himself during his early, failed attempts at converting the Cathars. These men were highly educated, intelligent, and utterly dedicated to their mission. They were the perfect instruments for the task, part detective, part judge, and part executioner. The inquisitors descended upon Languedoc and established a network of tribunals in cities like Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Albi. Their methods were a chilling blueprint for the totalitarian states of the future. They began by instituting a time of grace, during which heretics could come forward, confess their sins, and receive a light penance. But there was a catch. To receive this grace, they had to name all of their fellow heretics and sympathizers. This tactic immediately shattered the bonds of trust that held communities together. Neighbor was pitted against neighbor, friend against friend, family member against family member. A web of denunciations was spun across the land, and no one knew who they could trust. Those who were accused and did not confess voluntarily were summoned to appear before the inquisitorial court. The proceedings were a terrifying parody of justice. The accused was not told the names of their accusers. They had no right to legal counsel. Any witness, even a convicted criminal or a personal enemy, was considered reliable if they testified for the prosecution. The burden of proof was entirely on the accused to prove their innocence of a secret crime, an impossible task. The inquisitors were masters of psychological manipulation. Interrogations could go on for days, weeks, even months. They would use leading questions, false sympathy, and threats against the accused's family to extract a confession. If psychological pressure failed, they had another tool at their disposal: torture. While not used in every case, the threat of it always loomed. The rack, the strappado, and the burning coal were all sanctioned methods for persuading a stubborn heretic to confess the truth. For the Inquisition, a confession was paramount. Their goal was not just to punish the body, but to save the soul by forcing the heretic to recant and accept the authority of the Church. The punishments varied. Those who confessed and recanted might be sentenced to wear yellow crosses sewn onto their clothing for the rest of their lives, a mark of public shame that made them social outcasts. They might be ordered to undertake long, arduous pilgrimages or have their property confiscated. The most severe punishment for a relapsed heretic, or one who refused to recant, was to be relaxed to the secular arm, a chilling euphemism for being handed over to the local authorities to be burned at the stake. The meticulous records kept by some of these inquisitors provide a dark and intimate window into this world of fear. The register of Jacques Fournier, the Bishop of Pamiers and future Pope Benedict XII, is one of the most famous. For years, he obsessively interrogated the inhabitants of a single Pyrenean village, Montelieu, documenting their beliefs, their social networks, their family quarrels, even their sex lives, all in his relentless search for the last vestiges of the Cathar faith. His records show a society saturated with paranoia, where a careless word or a suspicious gesture could lead to the torture chamber. This bureaucratic machine of fear was brutally effective. Over the course of several decades, it systematically dismantled the underground Cathar Church, one believer at a time. The networks of safe houses were exposed, the traveling perfects were captured, and the laity was terrorized into submission. But even in the face of this overwhelming terror, a final bastion of Cathar resistance held out, a place that would become the enduring symbol of their faith and their tragic fate, the mountain fortress of Montségur. Montségur was more than a castle. It was a sanctuary, a symbol, the beating heart of the dying Cathar faith. Perched at an altitude of over 1,200 meters on a formidable, sheer-sided peak, a puog, it seemed almost to touch the sky, a fortress of last resort for a people on the run. For years, as the Inquisition tightened its grip on the valleys below, Montségur had served as a refuge for hunted Cathar perfects and a center for the clandestine church. It was the unofficial capital of a religion that no longer had a place on earth. By the year 1243, the French royal authorities and the Catholic Church decided that this final, defiant symbol had to be extinguished. In the spring of that year, a royal army of several thousand soldiers arrived at the foot of the mountain and began one of the most arduous and legendary sieges in medieval history. The fortress was defended by about 100 soldiers and their families, but its true significance lay in its other residents, more than 200 Cathar perfects, both men and women, who had sought refuge there, along with several hundred civilian believers. For 10 long months, through a scorching summer and a brutal winter, the small garrison held out against the overwhelming force below. The siege was a masterpiece of medieval engineering and raw courage. The attackers had to haul their heavy siege engines, catapults and trebuchets up the steep, treacherous slopes. The defenders, fighting for their very existence, repelled assault after assault, raining down rocks and arrows on the soldiers clambering up the rock face. Life inside the fortress was incredibly harsh. Food and water were scarce, and the defenders were exposed to the elements on the windswept summit. Yet their resolve did not break. They were sustained by the presence of the perfects, whose serene faith gave meaning to their desperate struggle. They believed they were defending not just a pile of rocks, but the last vestige of the true Church of Christ on earth. The turning point in the siege came when a small group of Basque mercenaries, skilled mountaineers, managed to scale a supposedly impassable cliff face during a daring night raid. They established a foothold on the eastern side of the mountain, allowing the attackers to haul up a trebuchet and position it to bombard the fortress's innermost defenses. The end was now inevitable. The defenders' outer barbican fell. Facing a final, hopeless assault, the commander of Montségur, Pierre-Roger de Mirepoix, negotiated a surrender. The terms offered were stark. The soldiers and laypeople inside the fortress would be allowed to leave in peace after confessing to the inquisitors. But for the Cathar perfects, the men and women who had taken the consolamentum, there was no such mercy. They were given an ultimatum: renounce their faith or be burned at the stake. A truce of 2 weeks was declared, to last until the beginning of March 1244. What happened during that 2-week truce is a testament to the profound power of the Cathar faith. In this final fortnight, with certain death waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain, a number of the lay believers, both men and women, chose to receive the consolamentum from the bishops inside, thus becoming perfects themselves. They voluntarily chose to join the ranks of the condemned, choosing a horrific death over a life without their faith. It was a final, breathtaking act of defiance. On the morning of March 16th, the truce expired. The gates of Montségur opened. A procession of the condemned began its slow descent from the mountain. There were 225 of them in all, men and women who had refused to abjure. They walked down to a field at the foot of the Puog, a place that would forever after be known as the Prat dels Cremats, the field of the burned. A massive pyre of wood and straw had been constructed there. The Cathars were not tied to individual stakes. They were herded into a large walled enclosure of stakes and brushwood, which was then set alight. The chronicles record that they went to their deaths without fear, many singing, climbing onto the pyre voluntarily, convinced they were being liberated. The great bonfire of Montségur burned through the night, a ghastly beacon visible for miles around. It was the symbolic death of Catharism as an organized religion. The Church and the French state had finally broken the back of the heresy. The fall of Montségur was not the end of the last Cathar, but it was the end of their last hope. The few remaining perfects were now scattered fugitives, hunted relentlessly in a land that was no longer their own. Their church was destroyed, their protectors were defeated, and their last sanctuary was a smoking ruin. The hunt for the last ghosts of their faith would now begin in earnest. The moral choice presented at Montségur is eternal. Would you choose to die for what you believe in, a martyr for an ideal, or would you compromise your beliefs to survive and live to fight another day? Tell us what you would have chosen in the comments. The great bonfire at the foot of Montségur was a public declaration of victory, but the Inquisition was a bureaucracy, and it was not in the business of leaving a job unfinished. The fall of the fortress scattered the last of the organized Cathar clergy, but it did not eliminate them entirely. For the next several decades, the hunt for the last perfects and their followers continued with a relentless, patient efficiency. The theatre of this final, desperate act of the Cathar tragedy shifted to the rugged, inhospitable terrain of the High Pyrenees and the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. This was a world of deep forests, hidden caves, and remote mountain villages where the old faith still flickered in secret. The remaining perfects lived the lives of hunted animals. They were constantly on the move, traveling by night, relying on a dwindling network of loyal credentes for food and shelter. They were men like Pierre and Jacques Autier, two brothers from the town of Aix-les-Thermes, who, in the early 14th century, led a last, heroic, and ultimately doomed attempt to revive the Cathar Church in Languedoc. They travelled to Lombardy in Italy, where remnants of the faith survived, were ordained as perfects, and then returned secretly to their homeland to minister to the last believers. For a few years, they managed to operate a clandestine network, performing the consolamentum for the dying and keeping the embers of the faith alive, but the eyes and ears of the Inquisition were everywhere. The network of spies and informants, honed by decades of practice, was too pervasive. One by one, the Autier network was unraveled. Pierre Autier was eventually captured, and in April of 1310, he was burned at the stake in Toulouse, his execution a major public event designed to demonstrate that the fight was over. The story of the very last generation of Cathars is one of almost unbearable pathos, a tale of isolation, fear, and inevitable betrayal. It is a story embodied by one man, Guillaume Bellibaste. He is often called the last Cathar perfect, though that may not be strictly accurate. He was, however, the last known perfect to be active in Languedoc, and his life story, pieced together from inquisitorial records, reads like a tragic spy novel. Bellibaste was not a typical perfect. In his youth, he had killed a man in a brawl and had become a Cathar while on the run from the law. He lived for years in exile in Catalonia, part of the Kingdom of Aragon, ministering to a small community of fellow Languedocian refugees. He was a flawed and deeply human figure. The records suggest he was quarrelsome, vain, and even broke his vow of celibacy, secretly taking a common law wife. Yet for the scattered believers, he was their only link to salvation, the only man who could perform the rite that would free their souls. His end came through the classic method of the Inquisition: betrayal. A man named Arnaud Sicret, a native of Aix-les-Thermes, whose own mother had been burned as a Cathar, was recruited by the Inquisitor Jacques Fournier. Sicret was a cunning agent. For over a year, he patiently infiltrated Bellibaste's circle of followers, pretending to be a devout believer. He won Bellibaste's trust, becoming his closest confidant. Then, at the opportune moment, he sprang the trap. He convinced Bellibaste to return to Languedoc on a secret mission, luring him across the border and directly into the hands of the authorities. Guillaume Bellibaste was taken to the castle of Villerouge-Termenès for his final trial. He knew there was no hope. He refused to recant his faith. In the autumn of 1321, almost a century after the crusade began, Guillaume Bellibaste was burned at the stake in the castle courtyard. His execution is considered the symbolic endpoint, the final punctuation mark on the history of Catharism as a living faith. With his death, the last apostolic link was broken. There was no one left who could ordain new perfects. The consoling rite, the consolamentum, could no longer be administered. The faith was now cut off from its source of spiritual life. The Inquisition's work of physical annihilation was complete. In the following years, they would continue to mop up, prosecuting suspected believers, often based on accusations of things that had happened decades earlier. They dug up the bodies of those posthumously convicted of heresy and burned their bones. They pursued the children and grandchildren of heretics, ensuring that the stain was wiped clean. The system had won. It had demonstrated its terrifying ability to hunt down and destroy its enemies, no matter how long it took, no matter where they hid. The last voice of the good men and good women of Languedoc had been silenced. But destroying a people is one thing, erasing them from memory is another task entirely, and one that the victors would now pursue with the same methodical determination. The physical extermination of the Cathars, culminating in the execution of Guillaume Bellibaste, was only the first stage of a much deeper project. To secure their victory, the Church and the French crown understood that they had to annihilate not just the believers, but the belief itself. They had to erase the memory of the Cathar civilization from the face of the earth, to rewrite history so thoroughly that this vibrant alternative world would be remembered only as a dark and monstrous perversion. This was the beginning of a systematic cultural genocide, a meticulous process of destroying a people's soul after their bodies had already been turned to ash. The first and most crucial step was the destruction of their sacred texts. We know from inquisitorial records that the Cathars had a rich theological literature. They had their own translations of the New Testament, philosophical treatises and ritual books that detailed the ceremony of the consolamentum. Not a single one of these books has survived. They were all systematically hunted down and burned, consigned to the same flames that consumed their owners. The victors ensured that the Cathars would never again be able to speak for themselves in their own words. All we know of their sophisticated theology comes from the hostile and biased summaries written by their inquisitors, a history of the victims written entirely by their executioners. It is as if the only record we had of a lost civilization was the prosecution's evidence from a show trial. The second weapon of this cultural war was the suppression of the language. The language of Languedoc was Occitan, a rich and lyrical Romance tongue, the language of the troubadours and of courtly love. It was the language in which the Cathar perfects had preached, and in which a unique and brilliant literary culture had blossomed. After the French conquest, the French language of the north, the langue d'oil, was imposed as the language of government, law, and prestige. Occitan was demoted to the status of a peasant patois, its use discouraged, its literary tradition severed. While the language survived in various dialects, its role as the vehicle of a high culture was deliberately broken. To speak French was to be civilized and loyal, to speak Occitan was to be rustic and suspect. This linguistic suppression was a powerful tool of assimilation, slowly eroding the unique cultural identity of the South and replacing it with that of the northern conquerors. The landscape itself was rewritten. The defiant castles of the Cathar nobility, the castra perched on their mountain peaks, were either slighted, dismantled and destroyed so they could never again serve as centers of resistance, or they were taken over and rebuilt by French lords and the royal administration. The sharp-edged independent fortresses of the south were transformed into royal garrisons, their architecture altered to reflect the power of the new masters. Places like Montségur and Pérepetus became symbols not of Occitan defiance, but of the French king's power to crush that defiance. The very geography of memory was altered to tell a story of righteous conquest. Finally, and perhaps most effectively, the victors controlled the historical narrative. Catholic chroniclers, men like Pierre de Vaux de Cernay, and Guillaume de Puylaurens produced the official histories of the Albigensian Crusade. In their accounts, the vibrant, tolerant and cultured society of Languedoc was painted as a cesspit of depravity and demonic heresy. The Cathars were depicted as devil worshippers, fanatics who encouraged suicide, rejected marriage, and practiced obscene secret rites. The Crusaders, even in their most brutal moments like the massacre at Béziers, were portrayed as agents of God's will, cleansing the land of a deadly infection. This version of history, the propaganda of the triumphant, became the accepted truth for centuries. It was a complete and total victory. By the end of the 14th century, the Cathar faith was gone. The Occitan culture was broken. The independent principalities of the south had been absorbed into the Kingdom of France. A civilization had been wiped from the map. It was as if a great, illuminated manuscript had been scraped clean, its vibrant colors and unique script erased, and a new, approved text written over the top. For almost 500 years, the Cathars lay buried beneath the weight of this official history, forgotten by the world, their story told only by those who had destroyed them. They had been rendered silent, a ghost civilization haunting the mountains and valleys of a land that was no longer theirs. The machine of repression had done its job with terrifying thoroughness. It seemed that the idea, along with the people, was well and truly dead. Can an idea truly be killed? For centuries, it seemed that the answer was yes. The Cathars were a historical footnote, a bizarre and obscure heresy mentioned only in theological textbooks, their memory successfully suppressed. Languedoc became just another province of France, its fiery history of independence cooled and forgotten. The ruins of castles like Montségur were left to the wind and the shepherds, their tragic stories fading into local folklore. But ideas, like seeds buried in the earth, have a strange way of re-emerging long after the gardeners who planted them are gone. The second birth of the Cathars began in the 19th century, an era of romanticism, nationalism, and a renewed interest in the medieval past. Historians and antiquarians in the south of France began to dig into old archives to look again at the stunning tragedy of their region's past. They began to challenge the official narrative written by the victors. They saw in the Cathars not devil worshippers but victims of a brutal northern conquest, martyrs for the cause of southern independence and freedom of thought. A new story began to be told, the story of a lost golden age, a tolerant and enlightened civilization of troubadours and thinkers crushed by the fanaticism and greed of the French monarchy and the Roman Church. Montségur, once a symbol of defeat, was reborn as a romantic icon of heroic resistance, a kind of southern Masada. This rediscovery was supercharged in the 20th century. The story of the Cathars, with its themes of secret knowledge, a powerful and repressive church, and a lost spiritual elite, proved to be fertile ground for esotericists, occultists, and alternative historians. Legends entirely absent from the medieval sources began to attach themselves to the Cathar tragedy. Stories circulated of a secret treasure smuggled out of Montségur just before its fall. Not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable. Some claimed it was the Holy Grail, others that it was the secret books of Cathar wisdom or the lost treasure of the Temple of Solomon. The Cathars were reimagined as mystical guardians of an ancient, hidden truth, a secret society that had passed its knowledge down through the ages. While these theories have no basis in actual historical evidence, they captured the public imagination and transformed the historical Cathars into figures of myth. The region of Languedoc, particularly the area around Montségur, became a place of pilgrimage for a new kind of believer, a spiritual tourist searching for a connection to this lost world. The ruins of the Cathar castles, now popular tourist destinations, became imbued with an aura of mystery and tragic grandeur. The story of their annihilation found a powerful resonance in a modern world, grappling with the legacies of genocide, totalitarianism, and the struggle for cultural identity. Their fate serves as a stark and enduring warning about the dangers of absolute power and religious intolerance. It demonstrates how a state and a church, working in concert, could achieve the total destruction of a dissenting culture using ideology as a license for extermination. The Albigensian Crusade was more than just a medieval war. It was the moment when Europe first weaponized the concept of holy war against itself, creating a legal and theological framework for destroying an internal enemy that would have terrifying echoes in the centuries to come. The Cathars lost everything. They lost their lives, their lands, their language, and their books. The world they built was so completely destroyed that we can only glimpse it through the cracked and distorted mirror of their enemies' records. They are a silent civilization, yet their silence speaks volumes. It asks us uncomfortable questions. What is the line between faith and heresy? Who gets to write history? And what is the ultimate price of believing in a different God? The victory of the Inquisition was so complete that it inadvertently guaranteed the Cathars a form of immortality. By trying to erase them so thoroughly, they created a void, a mystery that continues to fascinate and haunt the modern imagination. The ghosts of the good Christians still walk the mountains of Languedoc. Their bonfires have long since turned to cold ash, but the light from their tragedy continues to illuminate the darkest corners of our own history. The victors wrote the history books, labeling the Cathars as a dangerous cult and their destruction a necessary cleansing. But today, standing at a distance of 8 centuries, we can re-examine their story. So we leave the final judgment to you. Who are the Cathars in the grand tapestry of history? Were they dangerous deviants whose radical beliefs threatened the very fabric of society and were rightfully extinguished? Or were they spiritual pioneers, martyrs to a brutal campaign of genocide, punished simply for daring to imagine a different path to God? Share your verdict in the comments. Your perspective is the final chapter of their story.